In the twilight of Nazi Germany's rise, Adolf Hitler sat at the center of a vast machine of conquest, deception, and ambition. To his followers, he was the architect of a new order in Europe. To his enemies, he was a dictator bent on destruction. But behind the propaganda, behind the carefully constructed image of a leader with unwavering confidence, there were plans so secret, so audacious, that even Hitler's most loyal generals were left stunned when they were revealed. This is the story of those hidden designs, plans conceived in the shadows of the Reich Chancellery, whispered among Hitler's closest circle and carried out without the full knowledge of those expected to enforce them. Some were brilliant in conception, others reckless in execution, and all of them would shape the course of the Second World War. The year was 1938. Europe was teetering on the edge of another great conflict. In Berlin, Hitler tightened his grip on power, transforming Germany into a war machine. But while the Wehrmacht's generals were preparing for conventional campaigns, Hitler was already envisioning something far greater, a vast empire stretching across the continent, driven by ideology and maintained by ruthless control. For the generals of the German High Command, war was a matter of logistics, strategy, and timing. For Hitler, it was destiny. He believed himself chosen to remake the map of Europe, and in secret meetings away from the cautious voices of military professionals, he unveiled plans that pushed the boundaries of reason. On November 5, 1937, Hitler summoned his top military leaders to the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. Gathered in a grand but tense room were men who would become infamous figures of the war: Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe; Werner von Blomberg, the Minister of War; Werner von Fritsch, Commander-in-Chief of the Army; and Wilhelm Keitel, who would later rise to the highest ranks of command. The document that would later emerge from this meeting was known as the Hossbach Memorandum. It recorded Hitler's sweeping vision for Germany's future. He declared that Germany must secure living space in Eastern Europe, Lebensraum, by force if necessary. He spoke of striking at Austria, at Czechoslovakia, at Poland. War, he insisted, was inevitable, and the sooner it came, the better. To his generals, the revelation was staggering. Many had expected careful diplomacy, a gradual buildup of power. Instead, Hitler spoke of massive expansion, of conquests on a scale that seemed reckless and dangerous. Some, like Blomberg and Fritsch, recoiled at the audacity of the plans. Others, like Göring and Keitel, bent quickly to Hitler's will. But the seeds of unease had been planted. The generals realized that their leader was not just preparing for war, he was preparing for a war that defied all conventional strategy. In 1938, Hitler's secret plans began to unfold. His demand for the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a large German-speaking population, sent shockwaves through Europe. The generals, still cautious, warned that Germany was not yet ready for a major war. They feared that Britain and France would intervene. But Hitler dismissed their concerns. He staged mass rallies, using propaganda to whip the German people into a frenzy of nationalistic pride. Behind the scenes, he orchestrated intimidation and threats against Czechoslovakia. When the Munich Agreement was signed in September 1938, handing over the Sudetenland without a fight, Hitler was vindicated in his own mind. His gamble had worked. The generals who had doubted him were forced to admit that his boldness had paid off. But many were still uneasy. For if Hitler was willing to gamble on such a scale now, what might he attempt next? The tension between Hitler and his generals only deepened as 1939 approached. The Wehrmacht's leadership had been trained in the traditions of Prussian military discipline, where planning and caution were paramount. They understood the dangers of overstretching supply lines, of provoking multiple enemies at once. Hitler, however, saw hesitation as weakness. He believed destiny favored the bold. His generals might worry about practical limits, but he saw himself as a man guided by providence. In secret discussions, he spoke of invading Poland, not merely as a military maneuver but as the first step in a racial war of annihilation. To the generals, this was shocking. They had thought of Poland as a political pawn, a territory that could be pressured or bargained over. Hitler spoke instead of its total destruction, its people subjugated or removed. Some officers, like Franz Halder, began to consider whether the army itself should move against Hitler. There were whispers of conspiracy, of removing him before he dragged Germany into catastrophe. But fear, loyalty, and the memory of Hitler's earlier triumphs kept them in line. Perhaps the greatest shock of all came in August 1939. As German troops prepared for war with Poland, Hitler unveiled his most startling move yet, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. For decades, Nazi ideology had preached hatred of communism and the Soviet Union. The generals expected that Hitler's long-term aim was war against the East. But now, the Fuhrer announced that Germany and the Soviet Union had agreed to a pact of non-aggression. Even more shocking was the secret protocol attached to the agreement. Germany and the Soviet Union had agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. Poland would be carved up, the Baltic states assigned to Moscow, and Hitler would be free to launch his war without fear of Stalin. To the generals, this was bewildering. They had spent years preparing for conflict with the Soviet Union, only to find that Hitler had struck a deal with his supposed mortal enemy. Some saw it as a stroke of genius, others viewed it as a dangerous betrayal of Nazi ideology. But as always, Hitler's word was final. On September 1, 1939, the storm broke. German forces swept into Poland, unleashing blitzkrieg, lightning war on an unsuspecting world. Tanks, planes, and mechanized infantry advanced with a speed and coordination that stunned even the generals who commanded them. But behind the dazzling military success lay Hitler's deeper secret plan. Poland was not merely to be defeated, it was to be destroyed. Special SS units followed the army, carrying out massacres targeting Polish elites, intellectuals, and Jewish communities. This was the beginning of a war not only for territory but for racial domination. The generals were shocked again. Many had expected a campaign similar to those of the First World War. Instead, they saw their fuhrer unleash a war of unprecedented brutality. Some turned a blind eye, others protested quietly only to be ignored. But Hitler's gamble had worked once more. Poland fell in weeks. Britain and France declared war, but their armies did not immediately act. For the time being, Hitler appeared unstoppable. In the spring of 1940, the German war machine turned westward. For generations, the generals of the Wehrmacht had studied the bloody lessons of the First World War. They remembered the long years of trench warfare, the futility of frontal assaults, and the seemingly impenetrable defenses of the French border. Most of them expected another slow, grinding conflict. But Hitler's mind had already moved in a direction that shocked them once again. He discarded the traditional plan of striking through Belgium with a cautious, methodical advance. Instead, he approved a daring and unorthodox strategy that concentrated the main thrust of his forces through the Ardennes forest, a region the French believed impassable for large mechanized armies. When the generals first heard the details, many of them were incredulous. The Ardennes was narrow, its roads twisting and unsuitable for the mass movement of tanks. If the column were stopped or bogged down, the German army would be trapped in a bottleneck, vulnerable to devastating counterattacks. It was, in the eyes of cautious commanders, a reckless gamble, yet Hitler insisted. He believed the French and British would never expect such a move, and that surprise, speed, and daring would compensate for the risks. The invasion began in May 1940, and to the shock of the world, Hitler's gamble paid off with devastating effect. German tanks and mechanized infantry pushed through the forest with astonishing speed, supported by waves of Stuka dive bombers that sowed panic among enemy defenders. Within weeks, the French army collapsed, and the British Expeditionary Force was driven to the beaches of Dunkirk. The evacuation that followed saved much of Britain's army, but at the cost of abandoning enormous amounts of equipment. Hitler's decision, mocked at first as madness, had resulted in the defeat of one of Europe's most powerful nations in a matter of weeks. For his generals, the victory was both exhilarating and unsettling. Some began to believe that Hitler possessed an uncanny instinct for warfare, a kind of genius that defied conventional military doctrine. Others, however, grew uneasy. If their leader was willing to gamble on such audacity and win, where might his ambition take them next? That question was soon answered in the skies over Britain. In the summer of 1940, Hitler turned his attention across the English Channel. He believed that Britain, humiliated by the fall of France, would sue for peace. But when Winston Churchill refused, Hitler ordered preparations for invasion. His generals warned of the immense risks. The German Navy was no match for the Royal Navy, and without control of the skies, an invasion was doomed. Hitler pressed ahead with the Luftwaffe campaign, convinced that the destruction of the Royal Air Force would open the door to conquest. For months, waves of German bombers struck at airfields, cities, and ports. But here, the generals witnessed something new, Hitler's plans beginning to unravel. The RAF fought back with determination, and Britain's air defenses proved resilient. The shift from military targets to civilian bombing raids, a decision Hitler approved in anger after British attacks on Berlin, allowed the RAF to recover. By the end of 1940, the German air offensive had failed. For the first time, Hitler's audacity met with defeat. The generals took note, but Hitler was undeterred. Already he was crafting his next move, a plan so vast and secretive that when he revealed it, his generals could scarcely believe their ears. In the late months of 1940, he turned his gaze eastward once more. Despite the non-aggression pact with Stalin, Hitler was convinced that the Soviet Union must be destroyed. He saw the conquest of Russia as the ultimate prize. the key to securing the vast resources and living space he had long envisioned. In secret conferences, he laid out the outlines of Operation Barbarossa. He spoke of annihilating the Soviet armies in a matter of months, of pushing deep into Russia to seize its cities and fields before winter. To the generals, the scale of the plan was staggering. It called for the largest invasion force in history, stretching supply lines across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. The lessons of Napoleon's failed invasion of Russia still haunted military minds, yet Hitler dismissed such concerns with contempt. He believed that the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay, a nation that would collapse once struck with sufficient force. The generals argued, some cautiously, others more boldly, that Germany was already stretched thin. Britain was still undefeated, the Luftwaffe had been weakened, and resources were not unlimited. Yet once again Hitler brushed aside their doubts. He saw himself as the master of destiny, and he would not allow hesitation to stand in his way. Preparations for the invasion continued in utmost secrecy. Even within the German High Command, many details were withheld. Some generals were astonished to learn, only months before the planned attack, the sheer scope of the forces being assembled. The Wehrmacht was reorganized, divisions transferred eastward, and a propaganda campaign was quietly prepared to justify the betrayal of the Soviet pact. By the spring of 1941, the stage was set. The generals who had once been shocked by the invasion of Poland, who had questioned the daring strike through the Ardennes, and who had watched in dismay as Britain survived the air war, now found themselves confronted with a plan that dwarfed all others. Operation Barbarossa would be unlike anything they had ever attempted, a war not only of conquest but of annihilation. And once more the generals were left to follow orders, uncertain of where this path would ultimately lead. In June 1941, the quiet along the eastern frontier of Europe shattered with the roar of artillery and the rumble of tanks. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's most ambitious and secretive plan, was unleashed. 3 massive army groups, numbering over 3 million men, surged across the border into Soviet territory. It was the largest invasion in history, a staggering display of military power. For the generals, even those who had doubted, the sheer scale of the opening victories seemed to vindicate Hitler's vision. The Wehrmacht advanced with breathtaking speed. Within weeks, Minsk, Smolensk, and vast swathes of territory fell into German hands. Soviet divisions were encircled by the hundreds of thousands, their soldiers taken prisoner in droves. The German High Command reported victory after victory, and many began to believe that Hitler's prediction of a swift campaign might be fulfilled. For a moment, the doubts of the generals seemed to fade beneath the weight of rapid triumph. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. The distances were immense, the supply lines overstretched, and the Soviet Union, far from collapsing, was regrouping with stubborn resilience. Hitler had promised his generals that the campaign would end before the Russian winter set in. Instead, the Wehrmacht pressed forward deeper and deeper into hostile land, the roads turning to mud with autumn rains, the skies darkening with early snow. The generals, now far from Berlin and burdened with the reality of the front, saw the cost of Hitler's audacity. The casualties mounted, equipment wore down faster than it could be replaced, and yet Hitler refused to adjust his expectations. He demanded more, pushing his armies toward Moscow, convinced that the Soviet capital's fall would bring the entire nation to its knees. When winter struck in late 1941, the German advance ground to a halt just outside Moscow. Temperatures plummeted, soldiers froze in their trenches, weapons jammed, and horses died in the snow. The Red Army counterattacked with fresh reinforcements, driving the exhausted Germans back from the gates of the city. For the first time, Hitler's vision of unstoppable conquest was shattered. The generals had warned of winter, of the dangers of overreach, but Hitler had ignored them. Now they were left to face the bitter consequences. What shocked the generals even more was not the failure itself, but Hitler's response. Instead of listening to his commanders' advice to withdraw to more defensible lines, Hitler forbade retreat. He insisted that every position be held at all costs, transforming mobile warfare into a desperate struggle of attrition. Generals accustomed to flexibility in battle were horrified. They saw divisions bled dry, units sacrificed in frozen landscapes, all because of one man's refusal to admit error. By the spring of 1942, Hitler was already preparing for his next gamble. Rather than consolidating, he demanded a new offensive toward the south, aimed at capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus. The generals were astonished. The army had barely survived the winter, yet Hitler insisted on striking again with the same boldness that had carried him through earlier victories. Many feared it was madness, but their protests were ignored. The campaign that followed would lead to the cauldron of Stalingrad, a battle that epitomized the clash between Hitler's vision and military reality. For his generals, the realization grew clearer. their Fuhrer's secret plans were not only audacious, they were increasingly catastrophic. As the summer of 1942 unfolded, the German army once again surged eastward. Hitler had shifted his focus from the failed drive on Moscow to the vast oil fields of the Caucasus, convinced that control of Soviet fuel supplies would strangle Stalin's war machine. Yet, alongside this southern thrust, a name soon to become infamous appeared on the maps of the High Command: Stalingrad. To the generals, the strategic importance of the city was debated. It was a key industrial hub on the Volga, but its value lay as much in symbolism as in logistics. Hitler, however, became fixated. The city bore the name of his greatest ideological enemy, Joseph Stalin. Taking it would be more than a military triumph, it would be a political humiliation for the Soviets. When Hitler declared that Stalingrad must fall at all costs, his generals were shocked at how personal obsession now dictated strategy. The initial advance seemed promising. German forces drove deep into the steppe, cutting across the plains with familiar speed. The 6th Army under Friedrich Paulus pushed toward Stalingrad, while elements of the 4th Panzer Army moved to support. By late summer, the outskirts of the city were under German bombardment, but the battle that unfolded was unlike any the Wehrmacht had fought before. Stalingrad became a fortress of rubble, where every street, every building, every stairwell became a battlefield. The Soviets clung to the ruins with desperate tenacity, launching counterattacks at night, ambushing German soldiers at close quarters. The generals watched in dismay as their mechanized divisions, built for mobility, were ground down in hand-to-hand combat. Reports filtered back to Berlin of mounting casualties and dwindling supplies. The generals pleaded with Hitler to reconsider, to allow a tactical withdrawal or at least to regroup. But Hitler's response was uncompromising. He insisted that the 6th Army remain in Stalingrad, that the city would be taken if only they fought harder. In November 1942, the catastrophe struck. The Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive that encircled the German 6th Army. Within days, more than 250,000 troops were trapped inside the city, cut off from supplies and reinforcements. When the generals urged a breakout while escape was still possible, Hitler forbade it. He promised that the Luftwaffe would resupply the encircled troops by air, a pledge that the generals knew was impossible. The scale of the operation far exceeded the capacity of Göring's air fleet. As the winter deepened, the fate of the 6th Army grew dire. Soldiers froze, starved, and fought without ammunition. Paulus himself, once loyal to Hitler's vision, sent increasingly desperate messages requesting permission to surrender. Each time Hitler refused, declaring that German soldiers must fight to the last man. The generals outside the pocket, men like Erich von Manstein, attempted relief operations, but without Hitler's approval for a coordinated breakout, every effort faltered. The encircled 6th Army withered, its men reduced to shadows of themselves. By February 1943, the inevitable collapse came. Paulus, promoted to field marshal in the final days, an act meant to compel him to die rather than surrender, chose instead to lay down arms. The once proud German army suffered its greatest defeat in history. For the generals, the shock of Stalingrad was profound. Many had doubted Hitler's judgment before, but now they saw the devastating consequences of his refusal to listen. The defeat cost nearly 300,000 German troops and shattered the illusion of invincibility that had surrounded the Wehrmacht since 1939. More than that, it exposed to the generals that Hitler's secret plans were driven less by strategy and more by ideology, pride, and obsession. Yet even in the aftermath of the disaster, Hitler refused to admit error. Instead, he shifted blame onto his commanders, accusing them of weakness and betrayal. In private, some generals began to speak more openly of removing him, whispering of plots that would one day culminate in attempts on his life. But for the moment, they remained bound by fear and loyalty, trapped in the machinery of a war spiraling beyond their control. As 1943 continued, Hitler was already planning his next great gamble. The generals, weary and skeptical, braced themselves for what lay ahead. For if Stalingrad had shown them the cost of blind obedience, it also revealed something more terrifying: that their leaders' ambitions had no limit, even in the face of disaster. By the summer of 1943, the Eastern Front had become a crucible of blood and steel, testing the limits of the Wehrmacht and the patience of Hitler's generals. After the catastrophe at Stalingrad, many in the high command understood that the Führer's secret plans were no longer merely audacious. They were catastrophic, propelled by obsession rather than reason. Yet Hitler's determination remained unshaken. He now focused on Kursk, a massive salient in the Soviet lines, as the site of his next grand offensive. The plan, Operation Citadel, called for a pincer movement designed to encircle and destroy the Red Army's forces in the salient. Hitler envisioned a victory that would restore German morale, reverse the losses of the previous year, and reassert his mastery over the Eastern Front. But the generals were increasingly skeptical. They had seen their armies overextended, their supply lines stretched to breaking, and their soldiers exhausted by endless winter and brutal combat. To attack again on such a scale seemed reckless, a gamble that might destroy what remained of their strength. Despite their warnings, Hitler pressed forward. In July 1943, the German army launched the offensive. Massive armored divisions surged toward the Soviet defenses, supported by artillery barrages and waves of air attacks. Yet the Red Army had learned from past defeats. They had built deep defensive belts, laid mines, and positioned reserves to counter the German thrust. The battle became a grinding, bloody clash of titanic forces, with tanks, artillery, and infantry locked in a struggle that would become the largest tank battle in history. The generals watched in horror as casualties mounted. Men and machines were lost at an alarming rate, and the Germans failed to achieve the decisive breakthrough Hitler demanded. For many officers, it became painfully clear that the Führer's obsession with grand gestures and symbolic victories was overriding strategic logic. Operation Citadel ground to a halt, and the Soviets launched counteroffensives that would push the Germans steadily back over the coming months. By late 1943, the situation on the Eastern Front had deteriorated beyond repair. The Wehrmacht was retreating from territories it had taken with great cost, and Hitler's generals were faced with the undeniable truth: his secret plans had led Germany into a war it could not win. Supplies were dwindling, morale was collapsing, and yet Hitler refused to concede any flexibility. Retreats were forbidden, reserves were hoarded, and unrealistic expectations continued to be imposed on exhausted troops. The generals' shock turned to anger and fear. Some, like General Erich von Manstein, began to speak more openly about the consequences of Hitler's obsession, warning that continued blind obedience would destroy the army and the nation. Others quietly began to conspire. Discussions about removing Hitler or forcing him to abandon certain strategies became more frequent, though always shadowed by the knowledge that failure could mean execution. Even as resistance grew within the high command, Hitler's secret ambitions remained relentless. He began to plan new offensives, still driven by ideology and personal obsession rather than military necessity. In the West, he fortified the Atlantic Wall against an expected Allied invasion. In the East, he demanded offensive actions despite dwindling resources. And in private, he spoke of miraculous victories yet to come, imagining triumphs that defied the grim reality on the ground. For the generals, the juxtaposition of Hitler's vision and the army's capabilities became increasingly impossible to reconcile. They had seen his plans shock them before: Poland, France, the Ardennes, the Soviet Union, but now the cost was undeniable. Millions of men had been killed or captured, vast territories lost, and Germany's strategic position was deteriorating rapidly. They realized that Hitler's secret plans, once the source of awe and fear, were now leading their country toward inevitable ruin. By the end of 1943, a quiet but resolute understanding had taken hold among the senior officers. Obedience alone could no longer save Germany. Hitler's secret ambitions had outpaced reason, and the consequences of his obsession would demand extraordinary measures if the nation were to survive the war. The stage was being set for the growing conspiracy within the military, as some of the very men who had once marveled at his audacity now resolved to confront the Führer's dangerous path. Generals had been shocked, then horrified, and finally compelled to act. Hitler's secret plans had revealed not brilliance but the peril of unchecked obsession, and the consequences would soon ripple across the entire Reich. By early 1944, the cracks within Hitler's inner circle had become impossible to ignore. The Wehrmacht, once a symbol of German military prowess, was steadily eroding under the weight of prolonged conflict, overstretched supply lines, and relentless Soviet offensives. Hitler's generals, many of whom had once been awed by his bold strategies, now viewed his secret plans with a mixture of fear and frustration. They recognized that his obsession with personal glory and ideological goals had supplanted rational military judgment, and that continued adherence to his directives threatened not only the army but the survival of Germany itself. As the Eastern Front bled German forces, the Allies intensified their pressure from the West. The preparations for the D-Day invasion were already underway, and Hitler's insistence on holding every inch of territory left little room for strategic flexibility. Generals like Erich von Manstein and Heinz Guderian saw the mounting disasters and began to question whether Hitler could be allowed to continue unchallenged. Behind closed doors, discussions shifted from hypothetical scenarios to real planning. If Hitler refused to adjust his strategy, might it be necessary to remove him altogether? The first half of 1944 saw a series of failed offensives and stubborn defense orders from Hitler. He forbade retreats on the Eastern Front even as Soviet forces pushed relentlessly westward. In Italy, Allied landings forced German divisions into defensive positions they were ill-prepared to hold. Each order, each secret plan seemed to escalate the danger, compounding the losses already inflicted on the army. The generals, once loyal executors of his strategy, were growing desperate. In the shadows of Berlin and other command centers, a quiet network of officers began to take shape. Their goal was not to seize power for themselves but to prevent total destruction. They observed Hitler's obsession with symbolic victories, cities named after ideological enemies, personal glorification of military exploits, and plans for offensives even as the army crumbled, and recognized the fatal consequences. Every decision, every secret plan he revealed, carried the potential to erase entire divisions from the map. One of the most chilling aspects of Hitler's planning was his refusal to acknowledge failure. Stalingrad, Kursk, and the continual retreats were never allowed to alter his expectations. The generals had seen firsthand how Hitler's insistence on ideological and personal goals over practical military strategy resulted in staggering casualties. Each loss reinforced the perception that the man they served had become untethered from reality, yet his authority remained absolute. The conspiracy that was beginning to form among the generals and senior officers was rooted in pragmatism. They had been shocked by Hitler's audacity, horrified by the human cost of his secret plans, and alarmed by the steadily worsening strategic position. Their objective was clear. If Germany was to survive the war in any recognizable form, Hitler's secret ambitions could no longer dictate military operations. The discussions that once seemed treasonous became a necessary examination of the country's survival. As spring turned to summer in 1944, Hitler remained unaware of the extent of the growing dissent within his command. He continued to issue audacious directives, demanding counterattacks on fronts that could not support them, and planning secret operations that relied on mythical reserves and miraculous successes. His generals, who had once been awed by his vision, were now carefully calculating how to contain his worst instincts while maintaining the facade of obedience. Hitler's secret plans, which had once shocked and impressed his generals, had now brought them to a stark realization. The man who had guided Germany to rapid early victories had become a liability. Each strategy was no longer a daring stroke of genius but a potential death sentence for the soldiers and the nation. The generals were forced to weigh loyalty against pragmatism, conscience against survival, knowing that the fate of millions rested on the next moves they made. Fuhrer, whose vision had once commanded their awe, and whose secrecy and ambition had now plunged their country into crisis. By June 1944, the war had reached a critical juncture. Hitler's secret plans, which had once dazzled his generals with audacity, were now unraveling under the weight of reality. The Allies had landed in Normandy, opening a western front that the German army was ill-prepared to contain. Hitler, as always, refused to grant flexibility to his commanders. He demanded that the German forces hold every position at all costs, ordering counterattacks and expecting miraculous successes despite overwhelming odds. The generals were stunned. They had long warned that spreading forces too thin across multiple fronts would invite disaster, yet Hitler's insistence on ideological victories and symbolic gestures over practical military strategy left them powerless. Armies were ordered into futile engagements against superior Allied forces, supplies ran dangerously low, and morale plummeted. Field commanders pleaded for permission to withdraw to defensible positions, but Hitler's response was unwavering: no retreat, no compromise, and no acknowledgement of mistakes. Meanwhile, the Eastern Front continued to collapse under the relentless Soviet advance. Operation Bagration, launched in the summer of 1944, shattered Army Group Center, resulting in catastrophic losses for the Wehrmacht. The speed and scale of the Soviet offensives once again shocked the generals, revealing the consequences of Hitler's obsession with holding territory and executing secret, long-term plans without regard for logistics or human cost. Entire divisions were encircled and destroyed, while Hitler remained fixated on maintaining impossible front lines. Within the Reich, the generals' frustration and fear had grown into active dissent. Conspiracies once whispered cautiously became organized efforts to curb Hitler's disastrous decision-making. Many officers understood that Germany's survival depended not only on battlefield success, but on containing the Führer's obsession. Meetings were held in secret, plans drafted, and contingencies discussed, yet the shadow of totalitarian control and personal loyalty to Hitler made open action perilous. One misstep could result in execution or imprisonment, making the effort both dangerous and morally complex. As the Western Allies advanced from Normandy, German forces struggled to mount a coherent defense. Hitler's insistence on micromanaging operations, often contradicting the advice of his experienced generals, compounded the chaos. Panzer divisions were moved in piecemeal fashion, reinforcements withheld, and critical opportunities squandered because Hitler's focus was on symbolic victories rather than strategic necessity. Generals like von Rundstedt and Model were forced to comply, witnessing firsthand the devastating results of obeying plans conceived in obsession rather than reason. By autumn 1944, the consequences of Hitler's secret planning became even more apparent. The Allies had liberated France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, while the Soviets pressed relentlessly toward Eastern Europe. Germany was now fighting a war on multiple fronts it could not win, yet Hitler refused to abandon his ideological objectives. He demanded continued offensives, including counterattacks during the Ardennes in December 1944, what would become the Battle of the Bulge. Even in desperation, his plans were audacious and unpredictable, shocking both the generals and the troops tasked with executing them. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last major gamble in the West, initially achieved surprise, but it quickly stalled under the combined resistance of Allied forces and logistical difficulties. The generals realized that once again Hitler's vision, his obsession with dramatic secret strategies, was driving Germany toward disaster. Supplies were insufficient, the terrain was unforgiving, and winter conditions compounded the difficulty. Once more, soldiers were sacrificed on the altar of ambition, while the generals struggled to balance duty with pragmatism. By the end of 1944, Hitler's secret plans had ceased to inspire awe and had become a source of fear. His generals understood that they were following a leader whose decisions were increasingly divorced from reality, whose ambition outweighed reason, and whose secrecy and obsession had brought Germany to the brink of collapse. Many began to contemplate whether obedience alone could save the Reich, or if extraordinary action would be required to prevent total annihilation. The war had entered its final, desperate phase. Hitler's audacious strategies, once a source of tactical genius in the eyes of some, were now a series of catastrophes. The generals, who had been shocked, horrified, and complicit, now faced the starkest realization of all. The secret plans that had once promised triumph were leading Germany inexorably to defeat, and the country's fate rested in part on their courage to confront the Fuhrer's obsession. The story of Hitler's secret plans is not simply a tale of ambition and strategy. It is a chronicle of obsession, audacity, and the human cost of a vision untethered from reason. From the early years of rapid conquest to the catastrophic failures on both the eastern and western fronts, these plans reveal a man whose imagination of empire exceeded not only his resources, but the capacity of those around him to contain his ambitions. The generals who once followed him with awe and caution found themselves increasingly trapped between duty and conscience, compelled to execute orders that defied logic, drained their armies, and led to unimaginable suffering. Each decision, each hidden maneuver, carried with it consequences that rippled across the continent, affecting millions of soldiers, civilians, and nations alike. The shock felt by his own commanders was not merely at the audacity of his vision, but at the realization that the very machinery of the state had become an instrument of personal obsession, and that loyalty, no matter how fervent, could not prevent the march toward disaster. The pattern is unmistakable. At every turn, Hitler's secret plans demanded not careful calculation but blind obedience, not measured strategy but dramatic gestures designed to satisfy ideology and ego. In Poland, generals saw the rapid conquest but recoiled at the moral and human cost. In France, they marveled at the audacious strikes through the Ardennes while fearing the instability such boldness might provoke. In the Soviet Union, Stalingrad and Kursk revealed the deadly consequences of unchecked fixation, as millions perished under strategies that ignored logistics, weather, and reality itself. Each victory carried the seed of catastrophe, and each setback illuminated the dangerous gulf between the Fuhrer's vision and the practical limits of warfare. For those charged with carrying out his orders, the tension between obedience and moral responsibility became a daily burden, a silent witness to the perilous path defined by secrecy and ambition. Yet beyond the military calculations, there is a human story woven through these events. The generals, soldiers, and civilians who lived under the shadow of these secret plans experienced the consequences of a leadership that fused ideology with personal obsession. Fear and respect were intertwined, and even the most seasoned commanders were forced to confront the limits of their own authority in the face of a man whose will eclipsed reason. The shock they felt was not only at the scale of Hitler's ambitions, but at the stark realization that the machinery of war could be so thoroughly dominated by one individual's imagination. They were spectators and participants in a drama where strategy and obsession collided, where the price of audacity was measured in blood, and where the nation's fate was dictated by visions kept secret until revealed too late. In reflecting on Hitler's secret plans, one sees both the dangers of unchecked ambition and the profound responsibility carried by those who execute the orders of power. The story reminds us that genius and recklessness can be inseparable in the hands of a leader, that audacity can inspire awe even as it sows devastation, and that secrecy can magnify both triumph and tragedy. The shock experienced by his own generals is emblematic of a deeper truth. History is shaped not only by plans and strategies but by the character, limitations, and obsessions of those who conceive them. Ultimately, the legacy of these secret plans is a stark lesson in the interplay of ambition, obedience, and consequence. It is a reminder that vision without wisdom can lead to ruin, that leadership wielded without restraint can bring nations to the brink of destruction, and that those who witness such forces must navigate the delicate line between duty and conscience. The story is as much about the men who followed as it is about the man who led, a narrative of shock, horror, and reluctant complicity that underscores the profound and enduring impact of one individual's secret designs on the course of history. It leaves us with a vivid understanding of the price of obsession, the weight of leadership, and the haunting echoes of choices made in the shadows.